So for my section, I want to say disclaimer: I'm not Canadian, nor am I Native, and I'm not able to educate from personal experience for this episode, nor will I be able to cover or fully understand the complex and nuanced history of residential schools and the violence done to Native people in Canada in the span of like 20 to 30 minutes. But as always, I encourage you to take the time to learn as much as you can about the horrors of this world, so you can actively work to build a better future for us and everybody else, and for yourselves. I will also give a pretty decent content warning. I'm talking about genocide, violence, systemic erasures of culture. I'm trying to think of like other things. Just lots of death, violence, and genocide related. Talking,
and to children is a big part.
Specifically to children. So if that is too heavy for you and you want to learn about it yourself and you do not want to stick around for this, totally understand, because it's going to get very sad. But let me get into it. From an anthropological standpoint, I think it's really interesting / messed up the way in which morality and intention are taught within Western society, and the really dangerous way it manifests in the actions of like white people, including myself in life, specifically how the obsession with being a good person actually pushes oneself away from goodness, because it all revolves around centering yourself and putting yourself like above others. When you're so convinced everyone needs your help, you stop asking whether or not you're actually equipped to help anyone, and whether or not your help is actually help at all. You stop asking whether or not your perception of help is actually damaging, and you absolve yourself of accountability when you focus on intention. So intention means nothing when your actions actually actively hurt others. I also think the problem with putting well-intentioned before the actions, the systemically damaging actions of white people, government officials, religious leaders, and others, is really like damaging. Sometimes the intention is literally what the action results in, i.e. systemic erasure and evidence and accountability through violence, i.e. cultural genocide, or genocide in general. Even if the results aren't what you intended, I think the intention has been manipulated to act as this like forgiveness guarantee when it doesn't work that way. And the forgiveness is not something we should require for doing better. The only positive use of well-intended for me can be used as a way for white people like myself to recognize and realize that they were only one step away from problematic or damaging actions, and that the line between good and evil is something we'll forever walk along, just because of the reality of what history is. And that being a good person still means you have the capacity to do bad things. And whenever your intention was, whether you meant to or not, it doesn't really matter, because you still did a thing that hurt people.
Impact over intention.
Yes. Something that we kind of live by here. In a book I read pieces of, because it's a whole book and I don't have the ability to read things over the span of a week. I read very slow. I plan to read it eventually, but it's called Unsettling the Settler Within Indian Residential Schools, Truth-Telling and Reconciliation by Paula Reagan. They go on into detail about the struggle within Canadian identity to recognize the true depth of violence that was committed in these schools, and like by Canada as a whole. For example, in the foreword of the book mentioned, Taya K. Alfred writes, Canadians like to try to imagine that they've always acted peacefully and with good intentions towards us by trying to fix the Indian problem, even as they displaced, marginalized, and brutalized us as part of a colonial project. Canadians do not like to hear that their country is founded through frauds, abuses, and violence perpetuated against the original peoples of this land. Canadians are in denial, in extremis. This stems from Canada's taught history of being peacemakers, of having better, less violent relations with Native communities than their American counterparts. The reality being that many Canadians feel absolved from the actions of their ancestors, as well as their passive neglect of the issues done by themselves, ignoring the reality that the last residential school closed in 1996, and that many Natives living today experience violence from these schools in their lifetime. The author makes a call for Canadians to recognize their role in systemic violence against Native communities, and also works to back up just the recognition with concrete action. So like realizing what has happened, but then not stopping there. So Reagan goes on to say, telling the whole truth about the history and legacy of the Indian residential school system means that settlers must consider the possibility that our relationship with Native people has never been predominantly peaceful or reconciliatory. Important decolonizing lessons can be learned from the ways in which teachers, staff, and various officials chose to ignore, vigorously enforce, and comply with or resist residential school policies and practices in various times and places. The problem that stood out for me was the overarching suggestion that many Canadians felt this violence was a necessary part of Native assimilation into Western society. Mm-hmm. And that there was like this inherent belief, and that there still is within Western culture, that Western culture is superior to Native culture. And that the creation of these schools, while it resulted in really sad things, was a necessary evil. This was a basis that residential schools were formed around in 1880. The very blatant white supremacy at play is as present today as it was in their formation. Many Canadians still think that Western culture is superior to Native culture, as they've been taught to think, and thus don't recognize the real damage that's been done. Ultimately, many Canadians realize that like the deaths were bad, but don't see the problem with the existence of the schools overall and the violence of this white supremacist thinking. Tayeke Alfred, in the foreword of another book titled Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition by Glenn Sean Coulthard, explains their interpretation of the thought process of white elites when viewing Native critiques on colonialism. This is a big quote, as I said, so... Then things changed. The mouths of natives started opening by themselves. Brown voices still spoke of the whites' law, democracy, and liberal humanism, but only to reproach them for their unfairness and inhumanity. White elites listened without displeasure to these polite statements of resentment and reproach. These pleas for reconciliation with apparent satisfaction. See, just like we taught them, they are able to talk in proper English without the help of a priest or an anthropologist. Just look at what we have made of these backward savages. They sound like lawyers. Whites did not doubt that the natives would accept their ideals, since the natives accused the whites of not being faithful to them. Settlers could still believe in the sanctity of their divine civilizing mission. They had Europeanized the natives. They have created a new kind of native, the assimilated aboriginal. The white elites took this all in and whispered quiet between themselves over dinner, as good progressive persons of the postmodern world would. Let them cry and complain. It is just therapy and worth the expense. It's better than giving back the land. And I thought that quote specifically like really stood out. And in that book as well, there's a line about basically how the creation of characters like Popper came to be, and like how children who performed well in these schools were basically taken aside and put into positions of power, and like kind of used to further hurt their own people because they were so disconnected from the culture, and rewarded for it essentially by like white elite people. That it kind of created this inherent feeling that they were still above and could benefit from the system. So I thought that was interesting as well. The book seemed really interesting. I highly recommend. I need to read the whole thing before I actually give like my full thumbs up on it, but it seems like it was saying something important. So what exactly happened in these schools? We went into it a little bit in Gabe's section, but I'll kind of give a little more of an overview. The residential school system operated cultural genocide with its purposeful attempt to erase all aspects of Native cultures. Students at these schools were taken far away from their families and homes and forced to embrace Catholic religion and Western cultural practices.
Kat, hold on. Do you want to drink some water?
Yes.
Yeah, do that and then start back up at so what happened.
Okay.
Just because I can hear you and I want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah, I was like talking really fast.
yeah, you have time.
Saying many words.
Plenty time.
Yeah, it still goes. So what exactly happened at these schools? I know we went into it a little bit in Gabe's section, but I'm going to kind of give a little more of an overview. The residential school system operated cultural genocide with its purposeful attempt to erase all aspects of Native cultures. Students at these schools were taken far away from their families and homes and forced to embrace Catholic religion and Western cultural practices and language while being banned from practicing their own. Students were given numbers, forced to have their hair cut short and wear uniforms. Boys and girls were kept separated, and even siblings were not allowed to interact with each other.
Jeez.
Any violation of these rules were severely punished and often resulted in deaths. The cause of these deaths ranged from outright violence to intentional neglect, often from the conditions of the dorms and the overcrowding of rooms that resulted in illnesses like tuberculosis and the flu to spread quickly. In addition to illnesses, many deaths were caused by fires or accidents that happened frequently. Sexual and physical violence were also widespread and caused many deaths, both directly and by suicide. On a website called Indigenous Foundations, they outlined some of the ways in which children were punished and abused in these schools, arguably with state and church officials fully aware of the abuses and tragedies taking place. Inspectors or officials that spoke up to demand reform or expressed any kind of alarm were often silenced or not supported, and promises for improvement were never followed up on. Abuses in the schools were widespread. Emotional, psychological abuse was constant. Physical abuse was metered out as punishment. And sexual abuse was also common. Survivors recall being beaten and strapped. Some students were shackled to their beds. Some had needles shoved in their tongues for speaking their native language. These abuses, along with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and severely inadequate food and health care, resulting in a shocking death toll. In 1907, government medical inspector P.H. Bryce reported that 24% of previously healthy Indigenous children across Canada were dying in residential schools. This figure does not include children who died at home, where they were frequently sent when deemed critically ill. Bryce reported there's anywhere from 47% on the Pagan Reserve of Alberta to 75% from the Feel Hills boarding school in Saskatchewan of students discharged from residential schools that died shortly after returning home. So the numbers that we were able to find in terms of like how many children actually died in the film, it obviously shows like the cruelty and the violence, not to the extent of the quotes, thankfully, just because that would have it would have not. It would have been just really psychologically stressful for any audience, but specifically, I think Barnaby's goal is to like make media that both Native people would want to see, and that would kind of feel very re-traumatizing, I guess is the word. There are many flashes to mass graves, much like that is being discussed in Canada today, as the number continuously grows higher and higher. The number I was able to find for identified bodies is 1,300, but a 2015 report showed over 4,000 children had died while at residential schools, so it's likely that that number will continue to grow as the investigation continues. In an article from the New York Times titled Canada's Grim Legacy and Cultural Erasure in Poignant School Photos, written by Ian Austin, he outlines that Indigenous communities believe the remains are some of thousands of youth, currently estimated to range from 10,000 to 50,000, who went to the schools and never returned home, known as the missing children. Something that really hit me is that the parents of the children were often given no explanation for the loss of life, and bodies were rarely returned to families. Their children were stolen and never returned. While Canada has pledged $321 million to support survivors of residential schools, as they should, and should give more, that is just a Band-Aid on a wound that needs stitches. In addition to the money, Canada as a whole needs to actively work to deconstruct the superiority complex that it's developed and accept that like money is not a cure. Nor will it be a guarantee of forgiveness. I feel like there's like no amount of money that can bring back the loss of culture and life that's taken place. Nor should it like be expected. Because I feel like lots of people who I've witnessed on TV expressing sadness about this are doing so. Like I, believe that they're being genuine, but I don't think that they're is a full realization of what's happened, kind of like in what I was speaking about before, in that like a lot of people recognize like the death piece was horrible, but don't necessarily recognize that
the erasing of the culture.
Yeah, the erasing of the culture, and like specifically like the inherent just white supremacist viewpoints at play that like are very much just like, yeah, that happened and it was awful, but we're not going to give anything back. We're not going to be able to fix it for real. We just want to be forgiven so we can move on, and so everything can get back to normal and less depressing.
Yeah. Well, it's also like we didn't do it, right? Like,
yeah,
it's the same kind of conversations that are happening with like critical race theory here, and like okay, yeah, we're not going to be held responsible for our ancestors' actions, and not realizing like that you have inherited the same beliefs because we don't have critical race theory, or because we're not revealing what happened and being accountable for it.
Yeah, and I guess there's also just like a disregard for the fact that this stuff is like still happening in a sense. Like for specifically because it was 1996, some of the people who were still in charge likely were around when these residential schools were in play. And like either willingly chose to ignore what was happening because it was inconvenient to their lives, or they just like didn't know but didn't care enough to try to look. It didn't directly impact them. And I think like a big piece of it is just the fact that like when you're looking at something that happened before and trying to atone for it, you're ignoring the fact that there's still actively damaging things happening like currently. I think that's an aspect of critical race theory that a lot of people try to like argue away, is that like it's like slavery was 400 years ago, but like people are still being murdered, people are still being forcefully incarcerated, so like it's like there's still a lot of damage being done just because, and like arguably still very much white supremacists in power, white supremacists on parade, like walking around with no consequences for their actions, both here and in Canada. So I think it's super gross, for one. But there are things you can do, arguably, in terms of supporting Native people, supporting organizations, to end it slightly on like a less horrifically upsetting note. There are some ways you can help, and there are organizations that are Native-led that it's geared towards like helping their people and helping each other. Indigenous Works, National Indigenous Leadership Groups in Canada, has resources on their website. The Inuit, Tepirit, Kanatami National Voice of Canada's Inuit group also has resources on their website. There was Assembly First Nations. There was a National Indigenous Women's Vote website, and a Legacy of Hope website. That all seem to be doing something positive. And I'm sure there are more, and I would love it if anyone who's watching, if you know of an organization that's making meaningful impact that needs support, if there are petitions, although it does seem like we're kind of past the point of petitions. I'm sure there's still issues taking place today that are relevant, though, and would need support and attention. Please drop the links in our comments so that we can spread the word, make sure that people know about what's happening, and also so there's like actionable next steps. Because I mean, obviously we don't live in Canada here for the Ghouls. We do live in America, where similar things have happened, arguably just as, if not more violent, towards Native people. So if I'll also look around to see if there's like resources specifically for here. And I've also seen things on TikTok in terms of like, not that TikTok is necessarily a reputable news source, but we're still going to mention it, that there's lots of things happening in for Southern Native people as well, that need attention, and need support, because the world is filled with violence and awful things. But there are things that we can actively do to try to make it slightly less horrific and awful. And honestly, just thank you so much to Jeff Barnaby for making media that makes people aware if they aren't already aware, but also like kind of can act as a form of catharsis. I think that's a word. Catharsis. Yeah. Catharsism isn't a word, I don't think, but catharsis. Yeah.
Yeah. I think because, a big part of this, you can pay money and, like you said, it's a Band-Aid. because people still lost so much of their culture and their identity because it was forced on them. So like thinking of like who's left who doesn't have that tie, and it's similar to Blood Quantum of like we are trying to take away and convert this idea and who you are into what we deem is the right way to be, and so like how are you going to fix that? And also thinking of all of the children that are lost, like you can't get those back, and those families are forever changed. There was potential and ability and they're all gone, and it's heartbreaking. And I, like you said, I thank Jeff Barnaby for making films like this because they constantly educate us, because we always look into it, right? We're digging more into it. We will have links to things in our show notes, so you can check out some of those interviews and other reviews of the film and information, as well as links to where you can get the books if you're interested in learning more. And of course, ways to help. In the Seer and the Unseen, there was some resources for current activists who are working to make a difference. So I'll be sure to include those as well, that are here in America. So because there's like, we're finding there's so much more to do. And I think that this film is like digestible enough and still shocking and stressful enough that you can still learn from what is going on and be upset.
Yeah. And I believe it was made in 2014. Is that correct?
2013.
13. And just the fact that like the headlines specifically are so relevant, specifically in Canada today, because they're finding all of this stuff. It's like he knew that was going to be happening. Yeah. Soon.
And even still, like, holding back. Like, we do see that mass grave, right? But it's, like, it's quick. Just like the violence, like, the death of her brother was quick. So it's, like, you're just, like, wait, hold on. And it makes you ask questions, and I think that's great. And so, again, I'm very appreciative of his work and work like his that are looking to highlight issues, but still be something that's entertaining that you, like, want to finish, right? Like, you want to get through. Yeah. You want to know. And the characters are amazing. So that is our, Good Ghouls Gone Bad. Closing it out with rhymes for Young Ghouls Gone Bad. So, very heavy. This series has been very heavy, as often happens with us, where we're covering things and we're like, oh, it hurts. This is a lot for us to deal with. And so next month, and for 2 months, so into the spooky month, we are going to be covering horror movie musicals, or horror musicals. Musicals that are horror in theme, to be a little more fun. But they're still, again, as horror does, is going to cover some things that are complicated and messy. We're going to have really great guests on to talk about the media as well. So definitely stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed to us. And definitely, as always, you can leave a comment. You can, shoot us an email, theghouls.nextdoor@gmail.com, to let us know what your thoughts are. If you have suggestions for what we should cover when we kind of circle back around to inevitably another cultural round of episodes, because people are still putting in work. There's still media out there being made to educate you and entertain, edutain you. And I'm sure there's like lots of other films that exist that cover Native issues. So if you know any filmmakers that are making such that we just haven't gotten to yet or haven't heard of or seen, please share. Because, yeah, for sure. The more we learn, the better, honestly. Yeah. Or honestly, even if it's just like Native people having a nice time, that's also... Yeah, we'd love to watch that too. Lovely to see. Even if it is the like positivity porn or whatever, I'll take some of that like in between this heavy stuff, right? Like, I'm a little thankful for them sometimes. And Jeff Barnaby, if you're listening, we'd love to talk to you. So let us know if you're interested in that, because we'd love to talk to you. yeah, maybe one day we'll talk to you, we'll talk to Joko, we'll talk to all the people that we love. And just, it probably just, it'd be less questions and more of like, you're amazing. Thank you for existing. Thank you for working so hard to get your stuff out there. Because it's absurdly challenging, right? Like the expectations for non-white men creators is ridiculous, and it's just like, it's sad because it just means that the world suffers from not having those stories, and after a while, like, we're just ending up with the same ones, and it gets tired and uninspired. So, you know, give more voices out there. Cool.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Kat?
I guess, like, if there's a thing that you know about and you're like, I think that wasn't that bad, maybe unpack and think about why you think it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
And the inherent, specifically with this issue, white supremacist viewpoints at play, so that maybe if you are savable in terms of being a not horrible person, that you do some realizing and kind of, just never, just question things and think about things, and the reasons for the things and why they are the way that they are and why you think the way that you do, and just always view media critically, think about things critically, develop that skill, because as sad as it can get, it is very necessary and will make the world a better place, ideally, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
Optimism.
Yeah. Don't think of it as like it's an attack on you. Instead, like, whenever I learn of something or I have to rethink or like relearn or unlearn, it's like, usually I'm just like upset that was like, that I was led to believe that. Right? Like, it's never like I'm awful because of this. It's like, oh, it's awful that was what I was told and what I was, learned, educated to think. And
that education was like intentional, like that they made you think that was a thing for. It's
like insulting, if anything. Like, I'm angry that that's what it was. And so then I want even more to not do that, and to like go against it. So don't make it like it is an attack on you and your character. If you are putting in the work to unlearn those things and to be better, then it's not, right? We all were taught that. We all were put in this, and we're all experiencing these different things. So take the time. Yeah.
It's kind of like the explanation of trauma. It's like, it's not your fault that trauma happened to you. It is your responsibility to heal from it. So it's not your fault that you were taught horrific and white supremacist ideologies. It is your responsibility to unlearn them and do better.
Yes. And so do that. Yeah. Learn more. Check out, like I said, our show notes. Listen to our episodes. Be inspired. Watch this film 100%. Watch all of Barnaby's films and then some. And let us know what you think. And we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Don't get married. They'll eat your kids.
They'll eat your kids.
Yeah. Yeah, they did. All right, well...